Thank you very much. So as Drew said, my name is Oliver TECKERT, and if you're here for the Anticipating Pain talk, you're in the right room. So I'll go ahead and get started. Who am I? So as Drew mentioned, I previously worked at Silicon Knights. I'd started in QA as a tester, moved up to line producer, and then a producer. I worked on 2 human X-Men Destinies. I worked on a couple of canned games, which involved prototypes as well as, well, you know what publishers are like. So yeah, those never made it out the door. And then I worked on proprietary engine development at Silicon Knights. And so right now I'm a senior production expert at Handsoft. And essentially my responsibility is to visit AAA studios around the world. And what I do is I consult with them on best practices and on how they do agile development or they don't do agile development, and what kind of processes they can pick up and how they can sort of revolutionize and move forward in terms of production methodology. And that experience and that time I've spent with Handsoft as well as my time at Silicon Knights sort of is what brings me to my talk here today to talk to casual development and indie gamers. And at the end of the day, a lot of the lessons that we learn at Handsoft and with AAA productions come right back to small indie developers or casual developers. And this statement, a simple agile production framework, will help you avoid being slowed down by your success. It is really the core of this talk. The idea that you can pick up a very simple, easy to use framework. It's very scalable, no nonsense, not a lot of overhead. It can really pay dividends. And I've got a story actually about a developer I used to work with, a very gifted programmer who sort of reminds me of, it's sort of who I base this talk around, and it sort of really canonizes the experiences that an indie developer has and the pains they go through. So the 4 aspects of agile development I'm going to talk to you about today is a feature-based backlog, backlog management, macro release planning, and sprint planning. Now, some of this stuff sounds scary, it might sound really technical, but at its base, it's actually very, very simple. And I'm going to explain it to you as I would anyone at a AAA development, right down to someone starting out on an iPhone or making a game for Steam. And so just to sort of lay the foundation of what we're discussing, what we see continually in the gaming industry, and especially with casuals and indies, are that smaller developers, such as the guys that make Super Meat Boy or the guys at Behemoth, they start out very small, and they grind, and they work really hard, and they suffer through a few years of work, and at the very end of it, they put out a game. And generally, you're not always as successful as these 2 are, but losing the mic. But when you are, that means you have 2 choices generally. You can grow, or you can join another developer. And typically, a lot of the indies and casuals want to go on, they want to grow, and they want to make it just a bigger game. And so that's where you get to teams of a larger size that might make Limbo or might make Minecraft. And then as your success continues, you turn into, and these are sort of Cinderella stories here, of Rovio or Zynga. And all of a sudden, instead of being a very small developer, you're now a huge developer with massive teams, and you need to adopt production practices that are going to work for you. And so we see this pattern. We see it in gaming constantly. We see it in technology constantly. We've grown up with it. It's really nothing new. And we need to learn from these practices and learn from some of the pain that we go through in developing for these products and in adapting our organization or a small indie sort of structure to prepare for growth or for success. And so when your organization grows, as I said, your team size grows. So you might go from 1 to a small team, and all of a sudden, that picture there at the bottom, that's Zynga. That's just one of their offices. And you can imagine if you started out with a bit of a framework of a production method or some agile development methods, that you're in a great place to grow, to bring people on board, and it's scalable, and it's not nearly as painful. And that's why I'm talking to you guys about this, because essentially, when you're small, when you're under 10 guys, or even upwards of 20, it is so much easier to adapt Agile practices and learn what it's about and put basic Agile practices into play. And as you grow up and as you get bigger or join larger organizations, it gets very, very difficult to change your culture, to change the way you work, and to get everyone bought in on very, very simple practices. And I spend so much of my time telling large AAA developers that they're not executing on very, very basic practices, which ironically, I could have a talk with a small developer and they could implement something within days, and they could see the results within a week or two. And so this brings me to sort of my story that I'm going to use as a framework to frame what I'm going to talk about Agile. So my friend Brian was a very gifted developer. He decided he was going to make his own game for Steam and iOS. He decided that he was going to program it himself, being the industrious individual that he is, and that he was going to sort of wear all the hats. He was going to be the producer, programmer, contract the artist, the audio, and put it out. Now, this is one of the most gifted guys I ever worked with or I've ever even met anywhere in the world in game development. He really was a gifted programmer. And he knew it was a daunting task, but he was extremely passionate. And the reason anyone gets into this industry is because they love games, and they love making games, and they want people to have that same experience. So, going on 2 years, Brian is starting to feel the pain. He works an 8-hour job at a game developer. He goes home and he literally codes for 8 hours a day, and he does sometimes 12 hours each day on the weekend. And no joke, he did this for years. And it was a superhuman feat, but it was fueled by this love of games and this passion to get things done. But he didn't really have a framework. He didn't really have a way of working. He didn't really recognize success except putting his game out. And he just started to burn out. I went to see him about a year in, and he had bags under his eyes. He talked about the game he was making like it was this burden that he had to, shovel and just carry everywhere. And it just became this thing, this monster that was diminishing his passion. And he was afraid. He was actually afraid that he was making compromises in the game he was making just to get it done, just to get it out, just to recognize some level of success and some level of relief. And so the answer for him was, look, I can help you create a simple, scalable production model. It's very easy. He was about 5 guys at that point. He had some outsourcers, some friends helping and chipping in. And I said, look, you only take what you need. You focus on the main feature of your game, which essentially is going to determine the success of your game largely. And you focus on quality. And don't worry about what you're doing right now. We can sort of incorporate aspects of that. And so what he had been doing, and I said, show me what you've done. And this is pretty typical. Doesn't matter if you're AAA, doesn't matter if you're a small indie developer, is he'd write a to-do list. And this to-do list would have everything that was immediately on his mind. And then he'd get buried by it. And he'd throw out the list when it became too stained with coffee, or he'd throw it out when it just became irrelevant because he couldn't possibly get everything done on the list. And he was constantly frustrated by this never-ending list. And again, he could never recognize any success or forward motion or progress towards getting his game done. There was no milestone other than we've released and it's making money. So the first aspect, and you've been waiting for this, I'm sure, is the backlog. And the backlog is like a game design document. It's like a living game design document. And what you do, and it's very simple, which is why I've not taken any effort to make this very complicated, is you label the game name, and you sort of indent under there, what is the main feature of your game? If you have multiple features, put multiple features, but usually small casuals or indies have 1 to 3 features that really drive their game. That's your business value. That's where the quality is, that's your value chain. That's what's going to make your game great if it succeeds. Now, under there, you list the tasks to getting those features done. And so you see task N. Essentially, the task is, what do I have to do to contribute to this feature, to flush it out? And now I'm directly linking my efforts, what I'm doing, the how, with what I'm doing. And The idea here is that no effort is not attributed to an aspect of your game that is directly related to its quality and what you want to appeal to your end user, to your players. And then underneath you have an asset list, because you're going to need assets, you're going to need art assets, but you don't want to confuse those with the core design and the core sort of code of your game. And you list the assets that are involved. And by itemizing your assets, you quickly get an understanding of, how much art am I looking at, and how much do I have to do, and how sort of how does this look? And so now we have a conceptual framework for our game. And it might look something like this. So I've got a game named Hero Quest, and under it I have a feature. It's the main feature of my game, sword fighting. And then I have, I have 5 tasks that I need to work on. And what you'll see here is I've added a bit of priority to give it a sense of urgency, because I need to know what I need to work on today, and what I need to work on later. But really what I'm concerned about is, what do I need to do now? What's immediate, and what's sort of the burning task that needs to be done. And under assets, I have a number of assets listed. And the idea being that I'm just listing the art assets as needed, keeping track of sort of, is my scope going out of my capacity? Can I handle this? Can I make this game? And I've added the priorities, as I said, which is going to come into play in sort of the next step of the backlog. And so the next thing to do is, once you have this list, you want to estimate and prioritize, because not everything on a list needs to be done, and not everything needs to be done now. And so really what you're concerned with is, how long is this, do I think, as an estimate, something is going to take to do, and should I be doing it now, or should I be doing it later? And I've got a picture here of, essentially, I've taken a backlog and I've prioritized it, and I've sorted it by priority. So now I have all the features in my game, I have them itemized, and I have them listed by priority. Well, what do I start working on Monday? If it's Sunday night, what do I start working on? I start working on the highest priority item. And if there are changes that need to be made to the priority of the items here, I change the priority and I reorder the list. And now I have a better understanding of what immediately needs to be done, and what sort of the foundation steps, and how do I move forward. And once I'm done working on these items, I move on to the next items, and I reprioritize my list. We do this all the time in life. We do it in grocery shopping, day to day, when you run out of time. We do it at this conference when you can't attend all the talks. It's a very natural, very simple, but very powerful method of organizing. And if you do it with a backlog, you have tremendous benefits. And so once you've got a backlog, once you've prioritized your backlog, you need to turn to the people you're working with and say, okay, we know what we have to work on. We know what the size of it is, and we have an idea of when we need to do it. How are we going to do it? How are we going to work? Who's going to take the lead? Who's going to support? And who's a primary developer, and who follows? And agreeing on a way of working sounds a bit like nonsense. I mean, you just get to work as an indie or a casual, but it's not, because the distribution of work is never even, and it's never the same at any 2 studios. I can tell you that the particular style of any studio anywhere in the world is always very unique, and always very particular to the culture, to the mentality of the people running the studio, and it's always different, and you always have to find a way that works best for you. And so by agreeing on a way that works best for you, that allows you to sort of celebrate your goals. Because if you only recognize a goal when you finish the game, you're going to be overwhelmed. You're literally going to be diminished into a tenth of the individual you were at release. And AAA developers know this. Indies find out the hard way, and so do casuals, that it's very draining. It's a very arduous task to make a game. It's a very difficult production process. So celebrate your goals. Acknowledge when you get the networking system done. Acknowledge when the combat system hits the point. The first time your game is fun is incredible, and that should be something that you should go out, take a break, acknowledge everyone's hard work, and allow your passion to sort of return and shed some of the burden of the work you're doing. And again, this is where the backlog helps you sort of itemize, and by prioritizing, you can sort of establish what you need to work on, and you make sure that you're celebrating the right things. And so the note here, sorry, the mic's coming a bit undone. So the big message here is you want to do a sustainable development. And the reason you want to do sustainable development is because you don't want to pass out on your desk. And you don't want to end up like Ryan. And if you end up, just drained and constantly thrashing between tasks and, your development becomes, and your game might not ever get finished. Or even worse, you might put out a bad game, something is compromised, which is terrible. It does not feel good. And so if you have kids, a mortgage, sustainable development, you really need to maintain your passion. And so we've talked about some of the steps of Agile development. And this is what AAA has used, but I've watered it down a little and made it a little simpler, and we've avoided some of the more complex issues. And so we've talked about the product backlog, and we've talked about prioritizing it and pulling those items into sprints. And a sprint is just a duration of work. The idea being that in 2 to 4 weeks, we're going to work on the top 5 priority items in my backlog, and then we're going to have a discussion about it, and that's in our sort of next build. Now here it says deliverable, but typically you wouldn't have deliverables if you're a casual. And so you've already started to join Agile development, and you've started to reap some of the benefits in terms of what you're doing. Now, if you're really interested in pushing your development and really interested in doing professional development, there are some sort of next level tricks you can do to actually be a little more similar to larger developers, and there are additional benefits you can reap. And the first is a sprint review. And a sprint review allows you to sort of look at the way you've worked, at the way you have burned down work. So this is a burn down chart. So it measures how many hours of work you completed each day over a set duration. And this is 15 days, and there were 26 hours, or 23 hours of work initially. And sometimes you're adding work. Sometimes you're discovering tasks you didn't know that needed to be done. And sometimes you're getting a lot done. You might work 8 hours in a day, but you might only make 2 hours of scheduled progress. And that's the nature of game development. You found bugs, you found things that were difficult, but of the things you needed to get done, you only got 2 hours done. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure you're working off an established, realistic time frame. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be doing this a while, and you don't want to work off some kind of fantasy schedule where you have 40-hour work weeks where you're actually doing 8 hours of work a day, because that does not happen anywhere. And the next step is that once you have this sort of sprint planning done and you're looking at the way you work and you're learning from your mistakes, is you do a bit of release planning. And so the trick here is that, I've laid out 3 milestones there a month apart, and the idea is that a month apart, so I'm going to work for a month, and then I'm going to take more items from my backlog that are high prioritized items. And then I'm going to work for a month, and I'm going to take more items from my backlog that I've reprioritized and updated. And what you can do is you can take a look at your backlog and your time estimates, which I have on the bottom there, and you can say, okay, in a month, because of my sprint reviews, I know I can get 25 hours of actual development work done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count down 25 hours of work, and that gets assigned to the first month. And then I'm going to count down, assuming that this is everything I needed to do for my project, which it won't be. I'm going to count down another 25 days. I'm going to assign that to the second milestone. And then for the third month, I'm going to assign the next 25 days. And so I have 3 months now where I have allotted a certain amount of work based off realistic and sort of, practiced measurements. And that gives you a forecast based off your own efforts, off your own ability to get these things done. And now I know essentially, or basically, where I'm going to be in 3 months. It gives me a bit of a forecast, and as an Indian casual, that's tremendous. I remember talking to Brian, and he said, if I knew in 3 months that I was going to have only this amount of work done, and I had known how much I was getting done, if I had actually seen how much actual development work I was doing, I would have been so much further ahead, because I would have understood that my project wasn't going to last 1.5 years or 2 years. It's going to last 2.5 years, which it did. And I can stretch myself out better. I funded my own game, so I can make the appropriate funding changes. And and my wife or girlfriend is not going to hate me because I don't hide in the basement all day trying to crunch to meet deadlines that were never realistic in the first place. And so I've essentially talked about, establishing early production practices and building on a scalable framework. And the reason for this is that once I scale up, if my game is successful, or I bring outsourcers on, or I bring anyone into the game, I can essentially just scale it up. It's very easy to add individuals in, to do the same practices, and to reap the benefits. And this is these steps are the same things AAA developers do. It's a little more nuanced. It takes a little more time, but the idea is still the same. And so by committing the commitment-based sprints, essentially because I know how much work I'm doing and how long it takes, I am actually committing to an amount of work and a duration that I feel comfortable with. And I'm not, working, again, 40-hour weeks, or like Brian, I don't have bags under my eyes. I'm not working into 3 in the morning and then getting up at 7 to go into my development job in the morning for 2 years. And if anything, development's a lot like playing the games that we're making. When you fight bosses in any games, and you fight any of these guys, the first thing you need to do is you stop and you need to watch what they do. You need to learn the pattern. Because if you don't take the time to properly learn the pattern, you're just going to die constantly to the same things. You're going to have the same problems, and you're never going to learn. But if you take a minute to look at how you're working and what you're doing, and you take a minute to see what attacks are killing you and what the pattern is, you can learn the pattern, and you learn what to anticipate, and you know what to do, and you don't get surprised anymore, and you're able to kill these bosses. And at the same time, in development, it's the same thing. It's the same problems over and over again. If you take the time to learn from your mistakes, if you take the time to put in practices to deal with the things that are killing you in development, and the crunches and the stress, you will smooth out your development cycle. You'll have more realistic time frames, you'll have a better time bringing people on board, and you'll make your life so much easier. And so what I've essentially talked about is scalable Agile for indie, and a feature-based backlog, and then you prioritize that backlog through backlog management. You do some macro release planning to figure out where you might be in the next 3 months, and then you do some sprint planning to figure out, how are we working? How much work are we getting done? How effective are we? And so these practices, are really simple. They're deceptively easy. And if you can do them as a casual or an indie, you are so much farther ahead, and you will reap the benefits very quickly. And I'd like to thank you for coming to the talk. And sort of the underlying message here is don't let your success slow you down. Be ready for success. And thank you very much.
We have time for maybe one question, if anybody has a question to ask.
First off, thank you very much for the presentation. How do you account for, kind of a multi-layered question here, but we've tried, we actually have downloaded the indie version of Handsoft and started down that path, and some of the guys like Microsoft Project and some like Unfuddle and all that fun.
Right.
The challenge I find is when I put together the master list for my coders and developers,
Yes.
and they look at that mountain,
Yes.
it freaks them out.
Right.
And then they go into holy shit mode, pardon my language,
Yeah.
and now you got a new problem. And then part 2 is you go, okay, well, focus on these 5 things, and they want to do the cool thing first.
Yep.
And you don't want to constrain them, especially the creatives, and the coders to me are very creative in their own way too.
Yeah,
you don't
absolutely.
want to hammer them and say, no, do 1, then 2, then 3.
Right.
How do you, what's your guidance to deal with the realities of human nature?
So the first question I got to ask is, how big are you guys? How many developers?
There's I've got 2 coders and 3 animators.
Okay, so yeah. So the first question is always, how big are you? Because I need to know how many product owners you would have. A product owner is essentially the guy who oversees the value in your development. He's the one who says, look, this is going to make a great game. This is a comprehensive product. We're not just developing, one silo. And so if they have one product owner, the product owner would be the first one to develop the backlog. And so he's the one that says, look, under this feature, these are the sort of driving tasks that need to be done. But of course, he consults the experts that say, you know, what do we need to do for networking or combat, et cetera. Once you have that list done, you would sit down as a product owner and you would say, okay, I need to do my own prioritization of this because that's where the value is, and I need to make sure that the most important things are getting done, whether it's for a demo, whether it's to set yourself up to show investors, or whether it's just to make a first playable. Once you have that done, and once you've done that as your own product owner, you can actually start to assign areas or features to different leads. So if you have a programmer and an artist that are working on combat and fleshing it out, I would say, look, this is your part of the backlog. You're responsible for it. You prioritize now after my prioritization, and if you'd like to change anything, talk to me about it. But understand that if you commit to something, you have to get that done. And at one point or another, all this stuff is going to have to be done. So there's generally a common sense way of working where I'd love to work on the cool stuff, but if you get combat working, but you don't have an underlying animation blend system, or you don't have textures on your characters, you've just got stickmen fighting each other at best, right? And so the idea here is that you bring them into the planning process as experts for their area. But clearly, as a product owner, you understand that you have the comprehensive view, and you sort of communicate, look, this is your sandbox, this is where you play, and I value your input. But at the same time, you need to understand that I need to, you know, do development for the whole thing. And that is the exact same, probably one of the most common problems I see at AAA developers, large-scale MMOs, and it's just, you know, that understanding and that mutual respect for each other's responsibilities will bring you very far. Yeah, no problem.
Well, great. Thanks so much.